Today we have a story about courage born from unspeakable grief, about a daughter's quiet strength that would shake the foundations of an empire built on cruelty. This is the account of Naomi Carter, an 11-year-old girl whose mother was murdered before her eyes, and who would return with an army to bring justice to a place that knew only oppression. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. From the recovered testimony compiled from Union Army records and oral histories regarding events at the Thornhill plantation along the Virginia-North Carolina border, spring of 1830-1, the tobacco fields shimmered gold in the dawn light, dew still clinging to the broad leaves like tears the earth had not yet shed. Naomi Carter stood beside her mother Ruth in the plantation yard, watching the other enslaved workers gather for the day's assignments. At 11 years old, Naomi was tall for her age, with observant eyes that missed little and hands already calloused from work. She had her father Daniel's quiet strength and her mother's careful precision qualities that would serve her in ways neither parent could have imagined. Her mother's carpenter tools hung heavy in their leather pouch, worn smooth from years of careful use. Ruth Carter was known throughout the plantation as the finest carpenter in 3 Minsa, woman who could measure a joint by eye and cut it true on the first pass. She had taught Naomi every detail of the craft since the girl could walk, passing down not just skills but wisdom wrapped in the language of wood and nails. Daniel Carter worked the fields, his broad shoulders bent under the weight of tobacco bundles. He was a man of few words but deep feeling, who sang low spirituals while he worked and taught Naomi to read the stars for navigation. Together, Ruth and Daniel had created a small sanctuary of love within the nightmare of bondage, teaching their daughter that dignity could survive anywhere if you held it close enough. Overseer Thomas Griggs paced before the assembled workers, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The leather strap coiled at his belt caught the morning sun. Naomi noticed how Griggs's hand never strayed far from it, even when giving routine orders. His face was lean and sun-darkened, with pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if calculating their worth in pounds of tobacco or hours of labor. Master Edwin Thornhill rarely appeared in the yard himself, preferring to leave the ugliness of control to his overseer, but everyone understood that Griggs's cruelty flowed from Thornhill's permission, like water from a poisoned well. The plantation operated under rules that shifted like shadows. What was permitted one day might earn punishment the next. This uncertainty was itself a form of control, keeping everyone perpetually off balance. "Carter," Griggs barked, jerking his chin toward Ruth. "Finish that new storage shed by sundown, and mind you, do it proper this time." Ruth nodded once, her face carefully blank. "Yes, sir." The words held no defiance, no emotion. This was survival's language, learned young and spoken daily. Naomi had been taught from infancy to keep her face still, her voice flat, her movements deliberate. Sudden gestures meant danger. Visible emotion invited attention. Attention brought punishment. Naomi followed her mother to the half-built structure, carrying the lighter tools while Ruth shouldered the heavier ones. They worked in comfortable silence, measuring and cutting boards with practiced efficiency. Their movements flowed together like a well-rehearsed dance, years of partnership making words unnecessary. "Remember," Ruth murmured as they fitted a joint, her voice barely audible. "Measure twice, cut once." Naomi finished, smiling slightly. It was their quiet ritual. These fragments of shared wisdom passed between tasks. But today something felt different. Naomi noticed how her mother's eyes kept drifting toward the main house, how her hands trembled slightly before each cut, subtle tremors that only someone who knew Ruth's steady precision would recognize. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher as they worked. Naomi noticed Griggs watching them more than usual, circling closer with each pass through the yard. His boots made a distinctive sound on the packed earth, a rhythmic crunch that set Naomi's teeth on edge. The overseer's face held something ugly, something waiting to break free like storm clouds, gathering on a summer afternoon when the air turned strange and yellow. Other workers moved through their tasks with the careful slowness of people trying to become invisible. Old Mary, who tended the kitchen garden, paused in her weeding to watch Griggs's movements. Her weathered face held a knowledge Naomi couldn't read, but the old woman's presence was somehow reassuring her, witness to whatever was coming. Just before noon, when the heat was thickest and the yard shimmered with rising vapor, Griggs strode toward them with purpose, flanked by 2 slave patrollers. The yard grew still as workers sensed the coming storm. Tools fell silent. Conversations died mid. Even the chickens scratching in the dirt seemed to pause, as if the whole world held its breath. "Ruth Carter," Griggs announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "Step forward." Ruth set down her saw carefully, the motion deliberate and controlled. She gave Naomi's shoulder a gentle squeeze before moving to face Griggs. The touch lingered longer than usual, a goodbye disguised as reassurance. Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest, heavy as river stones. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming hard to breathe. Naomi's hands went numb around the hammer she held. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this moment was a hinge, that everything before it belonged to one life, and everything after would belong to another. She did not yet know how right that voice was. "We found your little workshop," Griggs spat. Drawing closer to Ruth, his voice carried across the yard like a pronouncement of judgment. Hidden under the floorboards in the old tobacco barn, files for cutting chains, maps of the county, lists of names. Naomi's heart stopped. She knew those maps had watched her mother draw them by candlelight, copying routes and safe houses from memory. Ruth had been helping people escape for 3 years, maybe longer. Naomi had kept the secret like a sacred trust, understanding that knowledge could kill them both. Griggs drew his pistol, the metal gleaming wicked in the sunlight. "You've been organizing escapes, haven't you? Running a regular railroad operation right under our noses." Ruth said nothing, her spine straight as the boards she'd cut that morning. The silence stretched taut as a boat. Around the yard, workers stood frozen, their faces carefully blank but their bodies tense with shared dread. They had all heard stories of what happened to organizers' public executions meant to terrify everyone else into compliance. "Answer me," Griggs shouted, spittle flying from his lips. His face had gone red with rage, veins standing out on his forehead. Ruth's voice came quiet but clear, carrying across the yard like a bell. "I serve God before any man." The words hung in the air like smoke. Naomi saw Griggs's finger tighten on the trigger, saw her mother's eyes find hers across the yard. In that moment, Ruth's gaze held no fear, only a fierce, burning love that would be the last thing Naomi remembered clearly about the moment. Before everything shattered, the gunshot cracked across the yard like summer lightning. Ruth stumbled backward, red blooming across her chest like some terrible flower opening to the sun. Naomi's muscles locked rigid as her mother fell, every instinct screaming to run to her. But years of survival training held her frozen in place. She had been taught from infancy, sudden movements meant death. To run to her mother would only ensure they died together. Griggs walked to where Ruth lay gasping in the dirt, her hands pressed against the wound that pulsed dark blood between her fingers. Workers stood motionless around the yard's perimeter, witnesses bound by terror and helplessness. Old Mary's lips moved in silent prayer. Someone behind Naomi was breathing in short, frightened gasps. "Let this be a lesson," Griggs announced to the yard, his voice carrying over Ruth's labored breathing. "This is what happens to those who forget their place. This is what happens to troublemakers." He aimed the pistol again. Ruth's eyes found Naomi one last time, and her lips moved in words the girl could not hear over the roaring in her ears. Then Griggs fired a second shot. Ruth's body jerked once and went still, her hands falling away from the wound. Carpenter tools scattered beside her like broken promises. Girl, Griggs turned to Naomi, his pale eyes flat and emotionless as river stones. "Kneel beside your mother. You'll stay there until sunset, so everyone remembers what she earned your family." Naomi's legs carried her forward without conscious thought. The dirt was warm under her knees as she sank down beside her mother's body. Blood soaked into the earth, turning the pale dust dark and sticky. She could smell it, copper and salt and something else. Something that meant life draining away into nothing. The world had narrowed to this. Her mother's cooling body, the spreading stain of blood, the watching eyes of 50 people who could do nothing. Naomi kept her back straight, her face empty, her hands folded in her lap. She would give Griggs nothing, no tears, no pleas, no visible grief. But inside, where no one could see, something was changing. The fear that had governed her whole life was crystallizing into something harder, something that felt like iron being forged in fire. She was memorizing everything: Griggs's face, the position of the guards, the layout of the yard, the faces of those who watched. Hours passed. The sun crawled across the sky, Workers moved through their tasks, stealing glances at the tableau of mother and daughter. Griggs posted a guard to ensure Naomi didn't move, but it wasn't necessary. She remained still as stone, a living monument to what they all feared most. When Griggs finally released her at sunset, Naomi rose on numb legs and walked to the quarters she shared with her parents. Her father Daniel sat inside, his face carved from granite, his carpenter's hands trembling. He pulled Naomi close, and they held each other in silence while darkness fell outside. Neither of them knew yet what would come. But that night, as Naomi lay awake listening to her father's quiet weeping, she began counting tools in her mind. Her mother's hammer, her mother's saw, her mother's careful measurements, and she began, in the darkness, to measure revenge. 3 days after Ruth Carter's murder, the plantation fell into a terrible quiet. Workers moved through their tasks like ghosts, speaking only when necessary. The unfinished shed stood abandoned, Ruth's tools left where they had fallen, no one willing to touch them, as if they carried some curse. Naomi returned to her work in the fields beside her father, but something had broken inside her that went deeper than grief. She found herself watching everything with new eyes, cataloguing patterns she had never noticed before. The way Griggs always kept his back to the oak tree when addressing the workers, the rhythm of the patrols, the gaps in the fencing, the distances between buildings. She was measuring, just as her mother had taught her, but now she was measuring for a different kind of construction. Master Edwin Thornhill appeared in the yard for days after the killing, a portly man with soft hands and eyes that looked everywhere except at the workers. He addressed the assembled people with practiced words about order and discipline, never once mentioning Ruth Carter's name. It was as if she had never existed, as if her blood hadn't soaked into the earth they all walked on. "There are rules here," Thornhill said, his voice reedy but carrying across the yard. "Rules that keep everyone safe. When those rules are broken, consequences follow. I trust we all understand this now." Naomi watched him speak, this man who owned her father's labor and had owned her mother's life. She saw how he tugged at his collar when he spoke of rules, how his eyes slid away from direct contact. He was afraid, she realized, afraid of what his own property might do if pushed too far. The violence was meant to terrify them, but underneath it lay his terror of them. That night, old Mary approached Naomi and her father at their cabin door. The elderly woman had worked at Thornhill for 40 years, and her face held the map of every cruelty she had witnessed. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Your mama gave me something," Mary said quietly. "Told me if anything happened, I should pass it to you." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal Ruth's carpenter tools and something else, a small leather journal filled with carefully drawn maps and notes. Naomi's hands trembled as she took the journal. Inside were routes north, safe houses marked with codes, names written in cipher. Ruth's life's work, preserved and passed forward like a sacred trust. She knew, Naomi whispered, she knew they were closing in. She knew, Mary confirmed, and she wanted you to have this, not to use now you're too young yet, but to keep safe until you're ready. But Naomi was already opening to the first page, reading by candlelight. The maps showed not just routes north, but a network of connections spanning 3 states. Her mother hadn't been working alone. There were dozens of people involved, maybe hundreds of, vast web of resistance operating beneath the surface of slavery's apparent totality. "There's more," Mary said. 3 nights ago, before they found the workshop, a man came through, one of the Maroon settlements, east of here in the swamps. He said they'd been building their numbers, training fighters, said they're always looking for allies. Naomi's father Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice rough with disuse. "Free black folks," Mary explained, "escaped and living independent. They raid plantations sometimes, help others escape. Your Ruth was in contact with them, planning something bigger." Daniel's face hardened. "And look what it got her. It got her killed doing what was right," Mary said gently. "The question is, what comes next?" Over the following days, subtle changes rippled through the plantation. Griggs increased patrols and instituted new rules. No gatherings after dark, no singing during work, no conversations between workers from different sections. He was tightening control, turning the plantation into something that felt less like a farm and more like a prison. But the tighter he squeezed, the more people began to push back in small ways. Tools went missing, work slowed, a gate was left open, letting livestock wander. These were tiny acts of resistance, almost invisible, but they accumulated like water wearing away stone. Naomi watched and learned. She saw which workers were willing to risk small She noticed who met each other's eyes with understanding. She was mapping the human terrain just as her mother had mapped the physical landscape. One morning, 2 weeks after Ruth's death, Naomi woke to find a strange mark carved into the post beside their cabin door, 3 lines crossing a circle. She recognized it from her mother's journal. It was a maroon signal, indicating someone from the settlements had been here during the night. She erased the mark quickly, but her heart raced. They were watching. They knew who she was, what her mother had been. They were waiting to see what she would do. That night, Naomi made her decision. She was 11 years old, small and powerless by every measure that mattered. But her mother had taught her how to build things from nothing, how to measure and plan and create structures that would last. If her mother had been building an army, Naomi would finish the work. She began that very night, slipping away from the cabin to the old tobacco barn where Ruth's workshop had been discovered. The floorboards had been torn up, the space beneath empty. But Naomi knew her mother better than the overseers did. There would be other hiding places, other caches of information. She found the second hiding spot behind a loose brick in the barn's foundation. More maps, more names, and something else. A letter addressed to whoever continues the work. Written in Ruth's careful hand. The letter explained everything. The network of contacts, the signals and codes, the locations of the maroon settlements. And it ended with words that would echo in Naomi's mind for years. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't mourn me. Finish what we started. They can kill our bodies, but they cannot kill the work. The path continues forward, always forward, until we're all free. Naomi folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside her shirt, close to her heart. She was too young for this work, too small, too inexperienced, but she was Ruth Carter's daughter, and she had been trained for exactly this kind of impossible task. The measuring had begun. 3 weeks after her mother's murder, Naomi Carter stood in the tobacco field and watched her father die. It happened on a morning when fog hung thick over the rows, muffling sound and turning the world ghostly. Daniel had been working slowly since Ruth's death, his movements mechanical and his eyes distant. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving only a shell that went through the motions of living. Griggs had been watching him with growing irritation, waiting for an excuse. It came when Daniel paused in his work, standing motionless in the middle of a row with his hands hanging at his sides. He was staring at nothing, lost in whatever internal landscape grief had carved inside him. "Carter," Griggs called from the end of the row. "Get back to work." Daniel didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear. He remained frozen, a statue of sorrow carved from living flesh. Griggs approached with his strap uncoiled, the leather whistling as he swung it. The first blow caught Daniel across the shoulders, but he barely flinched. The second and third landed with sounds like axefalls on wet wood. Still, Daniel didn't move, didn't cry out, didn't defend himself. He had already left, Naomi realized. Whatever essential part of her father made him Daniel Carter had departed the moment Ruth fell. This body standing in the field was just the remainder, waiting for permission to stop. "I said work," Griggs snarled, raising the strap again. "I can't," Daniel said quietly. The first words Naomi had heard him speak in days. "I have nothing left." The words held no defiance, only a terrible, exhausted truth. But Griggs heard challenge in them. His face twisted with rage, and he drew his pistol, the same one that had killed Ruth. "You think you can quit on me?" Griggs shouted. "You think you get to decide when you're done?" "Yes," Daniel said simply, and he closed his eyes. The shot echoed across the field. Daniel fell between the tobacco rows, his blood watering the same earth that had drunk Ruth's 3 weeks before. Naomi stood 15 feet away, close enough to see everything but too far away to touch him, and something inside her finally shattered completely. She did not scream, she did not run to him. She had learned that lesson already. Instead, she simply stopped feeling anything at all. The grief was too large to process, too total to comprehend. It had to be set aside, locked away in a place where it couldn't destroy her. Later, she would realize this was the moment she became something other than a child. The moment when survival calculus replaced human emotion, when strategic thinking crowded out the capacity for normal feeling. Griggs left Daniel's body in the field as another lesson, another warning. 2 workers were assigned to drag him away at day's end. Naomi returned to work as if nothing had happened, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind went somewhere else entirely. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in the cabin she had shared with her parents, surrounded by their few possessions, and made her plans. She could not stay here. That much was clear. Griggs had taken everything from her mother, father, home, future. To remain would mean accepting that loss, learning to live with it, becoming complicit in the system that had created it. But neither could she simply run. Her mother had been building something larger than individual escape. She had been constructing a resistance network, creating structures that could save dozens or hundreds of people. To abandon that work would dishonor everything Ruth had died for. The answer came to her in the darkest hour before dawn, when exhaustion and grief had worn away everything except the essential core of who she was. She would not run from Thornhill, she would destroy it. The thought should have been impossibly a girl with no resources, no allies, no power. But Naomi had her mother's maps, her mother's contacts, and her mother's careful training in how to build things that would last. She had rage, cold and clear as winter ice, and she had nothing left to lose. The next morning, Naomi approached old Mary in the kitchen garden. The elderly woman looked at her with knowing eyes, seeing something in Naomi's face that hadn't been there before. "You're leaving," Mary said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Naomi confirmed, "but I'm coming back." Mary was silent for a long moment, her weathered hands still among the herbs she was tending. "Your mama tried quiet resistance. You planning something louder." "I'm planning justice," Naomi said. "For her, for my father, for everyone who's died in this place. That's a heavy load for a child to carry. I'm not a child anymore." The words came out flat, emotionless. "They killed that 3 weeks ago." Mary met her eyes and slowly nodded. "What do you need?" "The maroon settlements. Mother's journal mentioned them. I need to find them." "East into the swamp," Mary said. 3 days' walk if you know the path. But they're careful about strangers. They might not welcome you. "They'll welcome me," Naomi said with certainty she didn't entirely feel. "Once I tell them what I'm planning." That night, Naomi gathered everything she would need. Her mother's maps and journals, a few days' worth of food stolen from the kitchen, a knife taken from the tool. She dressed in her darkest clothes and waited for the moon to set. At midnight, she slipped from the cabin and made her way to the eastern fence line. She had studied the patrol patterns for weeks. She knew where the gaps were, when the guards changed shifts, where the dogs were kennelled. She moved like smoke through the darkness, using every trick her mother had taught her about moving unseen. The fence was 12 feet tall, but there was a drainage culvert that ran beneath it, barely large enough for a child. But Naomi was thin from hunger and driven by purpose. She crawled through mud and standing water, emerged on the other side covered in filth but free. Behind her, Thornhill Plantation lay sleeping, unaware that it had just released something that would return to devour it. Naomi looked back once at the buildings silhouetted against the stars. She thought of her mother's body, buried in the plantation cemetery with no marker. She thought of her father, lying tonight in a shallow grave beside her. "I'm coming back," she whispered to the darkness, "with an army." Then she turned east toward the swamps and began walking, 11 years old and absolutely alone, carrying her mother's maps and her father's ghost and a rage that would remake the world. The swamp swallowed Naomi whole. For 3 days she walked east, following the maps her mother had drawn, moving through a landscape that seemed designed to kill the unwary. The water was black and still, reflecting nothing. Strange birds called from trees she couldn't see. Twice she heard splashing that might have been alligators, and once she woke to find a snake coiled near her head. Copperhead. Deadly. She was alone in a way she had never experienced. No overseer's voice calling orders, no other workers moving in familiar rhythms around her. Just the swamp and her thoughts and the persistent, gnawing hunger that made her lightheaded. On the third night, as she huddled on a relatively dry piece of ground, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She had been running on rage and purpose, but her body was 11 years old and pushed past its limits. She fell asleep against a cypress trunk and dreamed of her mother teaching her to measure angles, her father singing low spirituals in the evening. She woke to find 3 people standing over her, so still and silent she might have dreamed them, but they were real, 2 men and a woman, all carrying weapons, all watching her with the careful assessment of people who had survived by trusting nothing. "You, Ruth Carter's daughter?" the woman asked quietly. Naomi sat up slowly, keeping her hands visible. "I am. We heard what happened. Heard Griggs shot her in the yard." The woman's voice was gentle, but her eyes were hard. "What are you doing in our territory, child?" "Looking for you," Naomi said. My mother's journals said there were settlements out here. People who fight back. The three exchanged glances. The older of the two, mental and scarred, with grey threading, his hair stepped closer. Your mother was helping us. True enough. But she's gone now. And you're awful young to be making bargains. I'm not here to make bargains, Naomi said, forcing strength into her voice, though she was shaking with cold and hunger. I'm here to ask for an army. The words hung in the swamp air. One of the men laughed, a sharp sound that sent birds scattering. But the woman raised a hand for silence, studying Naomi with new intensity. An army, she repeated. To do what? To go back to Thornhill Plantation, Naomi said. To hold a trial for Overseer Thomas Griggs, to make him confess his crimes and answer for them. That's suicide, the scarred man said flatly. Even if we could gather the numbers which we can't, marching on a working plantation, the militia would come down on us like judgment. Not if we do it right, Naomi said. She pulled out her mother's journals, spreading them on the ground. My mother was building something. She had contacts across 3 states. Look, the woman knelt beside her, studying the maps by moonlight. Her eyes widened as she traced the routes, read the codes, understood the scope of what Ruth Carter had been assembling. Sweet Lord, she whispered. She was planning a coordinated action. Multiple plantations at once, overwhelming the local militia, creating safe corridors north. And she died before she could finish, Naomi said. But the network is still there. The contacts are still in place. We just need someone to pull it together. Someone, the scarred man said pointedly, who isn't 11 years old. Then, find someone, Naomi challenged. Find whoever you think should lead this, but do it fast, because every day that passes, more people die. My mother died. My father died. How many more are you willing to let them kill while you sit out here in the swamp? The words were harsh, perhaps too harsh for a child to speak to adults who could easily kill her. But Naomi had moved beyond caring about social niceties. She had measured the distance between her pain and theirs, and found them equal. The woman who later introduced herself as Rachel, Freeman, looked at Naomi for a long moment. Then she turned to her companions. Get Marcus and Hannah, and send runners to the other camps. Tell them we need a council. Fast. Rachel, the scarred man began. She's right, Joseph, Rachel interrupted. We've been hiding out here for years, picking off targets when we can, helping people escape one by one. But Ruth Carter was building something bigger. Maybe it's time we finished what she started. Over the next 2 weeks, Naomi lived in the Maroon settlement and learned what freedom looked like for those who had taken it by force. The settlement held perhaps 60 people, men, women, children, all living in structures built from swamp wood and determination. They had gardens, livestock stolen from nearby plantations, even a small school where children learned to read. But they also had weapons, rifles and pistols acquired through careful raids, ammunition stockpiled grain by grain, and they had skills, former overseers who had defected, soldiers who had escaped military service, craftspeople of every kind. They had, in other words, the foundation of an army. Marcus Williams, the settlement's de facto military leader, was a massive man with gentle eyes and the calculating mind of a born strategist. He sat with Naomi for hours, going through Ruth's journals, understanding the network she had built. This is remarkable, he said, tracing routes on the map. She had contacts I didn't know existed, safe houses I never heard of. And look, here she was coordinating with at least 5 other Maroon settlements. Can you reach them? Naomi asked. Some, maybe most. Marcus looked at her seriously. But I need to know something, Naomi. What happens after? Say we gather an army, march on Thornhill, hold this trial you're planning. Then what? We can't hold the plantation. The militia will come. People will die. People are already dying, Naomi said, echoing the words that had become her mantra. At least this way, it means something. At least this way, they'll know we fought back. That's not a plan, that's revenge. Justice, Naomi corrected. Yes, maybe also revenge. But my mother died organizing escapes, one by one, quiet resistance. And Griggs shot her in the yard like a dog. Maybe it's time for loud resistance. Maybe it's time they learned to be afraid of us, instead of the other way around. Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. Your mother was one of the best people I've known. If a daughter is asking for this, if she died building toward this, then maybe we owe it to her to try. Hannah Lewis, who served as the settlement's diplomat and negotiator, took charge of reaching out to Ruth's network. She sent runners to other settlements, to safe houses, to conductors on the secret paths north. The message was simple. Ruth Carter's daughter is calling for justice. Will you answer? The responses came slowly at first, then faster. Some refused a dangerous, too exposed, too risky. But others said yes. They had known Ruth Carter. They had worked with her, trusted her, believed in her vision of something larger than individual survival. Within a month, commitments came from 4 other maroon settlements, from 3 plantation resistance cells who promised to rise when the time came, from conductors who would guide refugees during the chaos, from free black communities in the north who would provide shelter for those who escaped. The network Ruth had built was activating, spreading like fire through dry grass, and at the center of it all stood an 11-year-old girl with her mother's maps and her father's stillness and a rage that had burned away everything except purpose. 400, Marcus said one evening, tallying the numbers. Maybe more. If everyone who's promised actually comes, we could field 400 fighters. 400, Naomi thought. 400 against 1 overseer and a handful of guards. 400 to balance the scales for 2 murders and countless cruelties. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was a start. The army assembled on a moonless night in late August, months after Ruth Carter's murder. They came in groups of 10 and 20, slipping through the darkness like shadows, gathering at a clearing, deep in the swamp where even the patrollers feared to venture. Former enslaved workers from a dozen plantations, maroons who had been free for years, even a few who had been born free in the north but traveled south to join the cause. Naomi stood on a fallen log and watched them arrive. These 400 souls who had answered her call. She had grown taller in the months since her escape, but she was still clearly a child, thin and small beside the adults who surrounded her. Yet when she spoke, they listened. "And my mother died trying to save people quietly," Naomi said, her voice carrying across the gathered assembly. "She drew maps. She built networks. She helped dozens escape over the years. And Thomas Griggs shot her twice and left her bleeding in the yard as a lesson to the rest of us." Silence held the clearing. Only the sound of the swamp insects and frogs and things, unnamed, broke the stillness. "My father died because grief broke him," Naomi continued. "Griggs shot him in the tobacco field when he couldn't work anymore. 2 good people, murdered for the crime of being human in a place that treated them as property." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "We are going back to Thornhill Plantation," she said. "Not to kill everyone, not to burn it all. We are going to hold a trial, a real trial, with witnesses and evidence and judgment. We are going to make Thomas Griggs confess his crimes, and then we're going to show the world that enslaved people are not powerless, that cruelty will be answered, that there are consequences." Marcus stepped forward, spreading maps on the ground that reflected the firelight. "Here's how we do it. We hit at dawn, when they're least expecting it. 3 groups: 1 to secure the main house and hold Master Thornhill, 1 to capture Griggs, 1 to control the yard and free the workers." "What about the patrols?" someone called. "We've mapped their routes for months," Hannah replied. "We know where they'll be. We take them out first. Quiet. By the time anyone knows what's happening, we'll already have control." Over the next 3 days, the army refined their plans. They drilled movements in the darkness, practiced coordinating large groups, assigned roles to everyone. Naomi insisted on being in the group that would capture Griggs. Nobody argued with her. Rachel took charge of preparing the trial proceedings. "We need witnesses," she said. "People from Thornhill who can testify to what they've seen. And we need documents, records of deaths, evidence of brutality." "I can get those," said a man named William, who had escaped Thornhill 2 years before. "I know where Thornhill keeps his books. If we take the main house, I can find the records." As the plans solidified, Naomi felt something shift inside her. This was really happening. In 3 days, she would return to the place where her parents died. She would face the man who killed them, and she would demand justice in front of an audience that included the entire plantation. The night before the assault, Naomi couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, clutching her mother's journal, tracing the careful notations Ruth had made. Here was the map that had led Naomi to the maroon settlements. Here were the codes that had summoned an army. Marcus sat down beside her. "You scared?" "Yeah," Naomi admitted, "but not of dying. I'm scared of failing, of getting people killed for nothing. Your mother would be proud of you, Marcus said gently. This thing you've built, it's remarkable. Even if it all goes wrong tomorrow, you've shown people that resistance is possible. That's worth something. Is it worth 400 lives? That's for each of those 400 to decide, Marcus said. And they all decided yes. They're here because they believe in what you're doing, because your mother showed them a path, and you're finishing it. Dawn came cold and grey, mist rising from the swamp like the breath of the earth. The army moved out in 3 columns, silent as ghosts, following paths Ruth Carter had mapped years before. Naomi walked near the front, her mother's carpenter tools strapped to her back, the only weapons she wanted to carry. They reached Thornhill Plantation just as the sun touched the horizon. The patrols had already been quietly subdued by advanced scouts. The guards at the main house never saw the fighters coming. Within minutes, Master Edwin Thornhill was secured in his own parlor, blubbering about property rights and proper procedures. Thomas Griggs was in his quarters behind the overseer's office, probably sleeping off whatever he'd drunk the night before. Naomi was the first through the door, moving fast and low. She saw him reaching for the pistol by his bed, the same one he'd used on her mother, and drove into his midsection with the full weight of her running momentum. They crashed to the floor together. Griggs was stronger, bigger, but Naomi had surprise and rage. She got her mother's hammer from her belt and brought it down on his hand as he grabbed for her throat. Bones crunched. He screamed. Then Marcus was there, hauling Griggs up by his collar, securing his arms. The overseer's face went pale as he recognized where he was, what was happening. Through the window, he could see the yard filling with armed fighters. Could see the workers from his plantation being gathered not as prisoners, but as witnesses. No, he whispered. No, this isn't you can't. We can, Naomi said quietly. And we will. They dragged him into the yard, where Rachel had already set up a makeshift courtroom, a table for the judges, 3 respected elders from various maroon settlements, seats for witnesses, and a space where Griggs would stand trial for every murder, every beating, every cruelty he had inflicted over 8 years. The workers from Thornhill gathered slowly, disbelief written on their faces. Old Mary stood at the front, tears running down her weathered cheeks. Court is in session, Rachel announced. Thomas Griggs, you stand accused of 37 murders and countless acts of brutality against enslaved people under your authority. How do you plead? Griggs's face was white with terror. He looked around the yard, seeing his former victims staring back at him, seeing the guns and the grim determination. This isn't legal, he stammered. You can't do this. I have rights. Did my mother have rights? Naomi asked quietly. Did she get a trial before you shot her? Did my father? Griggs had no answer. His mouth worked soundlessly. Call the first witness, Rachel said, and the reckoning began. The trial lasted 6 hours, and with each testimony, Thomas Griggs shrank further into himself. Old Mary testified first, her voice steady despite her age. She described murders she had witnessed over 8 years, 37 that she could name, others whose names had been forgotten or never known. Each recitation was precise, factual, devastating. James Peterson, beaten to death for talking back, June of 1854. Sarah Williams, whipped until she bled out, September 1825. Marcus Henry, not this Marcus, shot for trying to run, March 1820-6. The list went on. Griggs's face cycled through denial, rage, and finally a kind of numb horror as he heard his own cruelty catalogued in such detail. William, who had escaped 2 years before, brought out Thornhill's record books. The plantation kept meticulous accounts. Everything was recorded, including deaths. Causes were usually listed as disease or accident, but the dates aligned perfectly with Mary's testimony. According to these records, William announced, holding up a leather-bound ledger, Thornhill Plantation has had an unusually high mortality rate compared to surrounding properties. 43 deaths in 8 years, from a population that never exceeded 70 workers. Master Edwin Thornhill, seated under guard at the edge of the yard, tried to speak. I trusted Griggs to handle. You knew, Naomi interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses. You paid him to keep us afraid. You profited from every tobacco harvest we brought in. You can't claim ignorance when you counted the money. Thornhill's mouth snapped shut. His soft hands trembled in his lap. More witnesses came forward. A woman named Grace described her husband's murder. A man named Joshua recounted being beaten nearly to death for singing during work. A teenage boy testified about watching his sister sold away as punishment for Griggs's advances. Each story added another stone to the weight pressing down on Griggs. His initial bluster had long since evaporated. Now he simply stood with his head bowed, his broken hand cradled against his chest, as the full scope of his evil was laid bare. Finally, Rachel called Naomi to testify. The girl walked to the witness space, and for the first time since the trial began, Griggs raised his eyes to look at her. What he saw made him flinch, not a child, but something harder. Something he had forged himself through cruelty. Tell us what happened on the morning of March 2nd, 1831. Rachel prompted gently. Naomi spoke without emotion, describing the accusations, the gunshots, the hours, kneeling beside her mother's body. She described her father's death 3 weeks later. She described the loss of everything except the determination to return. And why did you return? Rachel asked. Because my mother taught me to finish what I start, Naomi said. She started building a resistance network. She started organizing for justice. She died before she could complete it. So I came back to complete it for her. What would you have this court do? Naomi looked directly at Griggs. I want him to confess. Every murder, every beating, every cruelty. I want it written down and distributed to every newspaper that'll print it. I want the world to know what happens here, what happens on every plantation. I want truth. And after he confesses, Rach pressed. What then? This was the moment Naomi had been preparing for. The moment when she could choose revenge or something else. She thought about her mother's quiet dignity, her father's gentle strength. She thought about what they would want. After he confesses, Naomi said slowly, we let the people he hurt decide his fate. A murmur rippled through the assembled workers. This was unprecedented, giving the victims power over their oppressor. Rachel turned to Griggs. You've heard the testimonies, you've seen the evidence. Do you dispute any of it? Griggs was silent for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to speak. No, he said hoarsely. I don't dispute it. I killed Ruth Carter. I killed Daniel Carter. I killed all the others they named, and probably more, I don't even remember. His voice cracked. I did it because I could. Because nobody stopped me. Because I convinced myself they weren't really people. The confession spilled out of him like poison from a wound. He described beatings and murders, casual cruelties and calculated terror. He implicated Thornhill, naming times the master had specifically ordered violence. He revealed a system's brutality in detail that made even hardened Maroons look away. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by his own confession, the yard was utterly still. Why? Mary asked from her place in the crowd. Why so much cruelty? Griggs looked at her with haunted eyes. Beclift, I was afraid. Every minute of every day, I was afraid. Afraid you'd all rise up. Afraid you'd kill me in my sleep. The cruelty was how I tried to make you more afraid of me than I was of you. And were we? Naomi asked quietly. I don't know anymore, Griggs whispered. Looking at you now, all of you, I think. Maybe I just taught you to hate me enough to do exactly what I feared most. Rachel consulted with the other judges briefly, then returned to the center of the makeshift court. Thomas Griggs, this court finds you guilty of 37 counts of murder and countless acts of brutality. The sentence will be decided by vote of those you victimized. She turned to the assembled workers. You have lived under this man's cruelty for years. Some of you lost family to his violence. The question before you now is simple. What justice do you seek? The vote was swift and unanimous. Not for mercy, not for forgiveness, but not for torture either. The workers of Thornhill Plantation chose simple, swift execution, the same death Griggs had dealt others, but with more dignity than he had ever shown his victims. 2 Maroons led Griggs to the oak tree where he used to give orders. A rope was prepared. Marcus asked if he had any final words. I'm sorry, Griggs said, and perhaps he meant it. I'm sorry for all of it. I know it doesn't matter now. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. Then they hanged him, watched by everyone. He had terrorized. It was done quickly, professionally. There was no celebration, no cheering, just grim satisfaction that a balance had been struck. Master Thornhill was next. He wept and pleaded as they brought him forward, begging for mercy, claiming ignorance, offering money. The workers voted on his fate too, but they chose differently. They chose to let him live, but stripped him of everything. They took his property records and burned them. They took his money and distributed it among themselves. They took his dignity and ground it into the same dirt where Ruth and Daniel Carter had bled. Then they sent him walking north in his nightclothes, with nothing but the shame of what he had permitted. By noon, Thornhill Plantation was free territory. The workers were gathering supplies, preparing to escape north along the routes Ruth Carter had mapped. The Maroons were organizing the exodus, ensuring everyone had a place to go and a way to get there. Naomi stood in the yard where her mother had died, feeling something release inside her chest. It wasn't peace was too much to hope for, but it was completion. The work her mother had started was finished. The debt was paid. Marcus approached her as the yard emptied. "What now, Naomi Carter? You've got your justice. Where do you go from here?" Naomi looked at the maps in her hands, her mother's careful work, now completed. She thought about the 400 fighters who had answered her call, who were now dispersing back to their settlements and safe houses and freedom. "Forward," she said simply. "My mother taught me to always move forward. There's more work to do, more people to free, more plantations that need to learn what happens when they push too far." "You're 11 years old," Marcus said gently. "I'm Ruth Carter's daughter," Naomi replied, "and this is what we do." She walked from the yard without looking back, carrying her mother's tools and her mother's maps, and the knowledge that justice, once claimed, creates a hunger for more. Behind her, Thornhill Plantation began to burn, not from arson, but from the workers, careful dismantling, taking apart the buildings board by board, erasing the place from the earth as if it had never existed. Some places deserved to be forgotten, but the people who suffered there would be remembered. Their names would be passed down. Their resistance would echo through history, and Thomas Griggs's confession would be printed in newspapers across the north, forcing people to confront the truth about the institutions they pretended not to see. 400 fighters had answered an 11-year-old girl's call for justice, and the world would never be quite the same. The march away from Thornhill took 3 days, with 400 people moving north through the routes Ruth Carter had mapped. They traveled in smaller groups to avoid detection, but the news spread faster than they could walk. An uprising at Thornhill, a child-led army, an overseer tried and executed, a master dispossessed. Some called it terrorism, others called it justice, but everyone heard the story, and that was what mattered. Naomi walked with the former Thornhill workers, helping to guide them to safe houses and connections. Old Mary stayed close, her ancient face finally peaceful after so many years of terror. The woman had lived to see something she never thought possible. Her oppressors brought down, her people freed. They reached the first Maroon settlement after 2 days of careful travel. The community welcomed the newcomers, though space was tight and supplies were stretched. But freedom, they all agreed, was worth the hunger and crowding. Naomi stayed for a week, helping people settle, making sure everyone had plans for what came next. Some would continue north to free territories. Others would join the Maroon settlements. A few, surprisingly, wanted to remain and fight to carry forward the work of liberation. On the 8th day, Naomi prepared to leave. She was heading north herself, to Pennsylvania, where she had contacts from her mother's network. There were people there who could continue her education, who could teach her skills she would need for the long fight ahead. Martha's found her packing her few possessions, her mother's tools and journals. A knife, a blanket, not much for a girl who had changed the world. "You're not staying?" he asked. "Can't," Naomi replied. "There's more to do. My mother's network extends beyond here. There are other people who need help, other plantations that need to learn what we taught Thornhill. You know they'll be hunting for you," Marcus warned. "Griggs's confession is spreading, but so is your name. Naomi Carter, the girl who assembled an army. They'll want you dead. They wanted me dead the moment I was born," Naomi said with a thin smile. "Being enslaved means living under a death sentence that can be executed any time. At least now I'm making them work for it." Rachel joined them, carrying a bundle, supplies for the road. "And this," she handed Naomi a leather pouch. "Money. We took from Thornhill's safe. Your share for organizing this." Naomi tried to refuse, but Rachel pressed it into her hands. "Your mother died for this work. Your father died. You've earned it, and you'll need it where you're going." The next morning, Naomi said her goodbyes. Old Mary embraced her like a grandmother, whispering blessings. William and Grace promised to spread word of what happened. Joshua, the boy who had testified about his sister, asked if he could come with her. He wanted to fight too. "Not yet," Naomi told him gently. You're 12. You need to be 13 at least, maybe 14. Get stronger. Learn to read and write. Then find me, and we'll talk about fighting. She left at dawn, alone but carrying the weight of 400 people's hopes. The journey north took 3 weeks. She traveled carefully, avoiding main roads, using the safe houses her mother had established. At each stop, she shared news of what had happened at Thornhill. She left copies of Griggs's confession, carefully transcribed, for distribution to sympathetic newspapers. The story spread like ripples from a stone thrown in Stillwater and Virginia. An overseer was found hanged outside his own quarters, with a note referencing Griggs's trial. The plantation owners blamed Maroons, but the enslaved workers whispered of justice finally finding its mark. In North Carolina, workers on 3 different plantations organized work slowdowns, demanding better treatment and threatening answer if refused. 2 of the 3 plantations gave. In Dotton, South Carolina, a Maroon settlement attacked a slave auction, freeing 15 people scheduled for sale. When caught, they carried a banner reading "Remember Ruth Carter." The uprising was becoming mythology, larger than the actual events. Naomi heard the stories with mixed feelings. Part of her thrilled to know that her mother's name was being remembered, that the resistance was spreading. Part of her worried that the legend was making people careless, inviting retaliation. She reached Pennsylvania in late October, 6 months after her escape from Thornhill. The free black community there welcomed her as a hero. Though Naomi felt more like an exhausted child who had aged a decade in half a year, they set her up with a family, Benjamin and Eleanor Harris, who had been friends of her mother's. They had a small house in a community of other free black families, and they immediately set about trying to give Naomi what she'd lost. Childhood, but childhood, once stolen, cannot be returned. Naomi attended the community school and learned mathematics and history. She helped Eleanor in the garden and Benjamin in his carpentry shop, using her mother's tools to build normal things, furniture and houses instead of revolution. But at night, she still planned. She corresponded with Marcusson and Hannah and Rachel. She tracked news of uprisings and escapes. She refined her mother's maps, adding new safe houses and routes as the Underground Railroad expanded. 6 months after reaching Pennsylvania, a journalist tracked her down, a white man from an abolitionist newspaper, who had heard the stories and wanted to interview the girl who assembled an army. Naomi was 14 now, taller and more composed, but still carrying that same quiet determination that had driven an 11-year-old to do the impossible. "Do you regret what happened at Thornhill?" the journalist asked. Naomi thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that men like Griggs existed, that systems like slavery exist. But do I regret fighting back? No. My mother tried to save people quietly, and she died for it. I tried to save people, loudly, and some survived who wouldn't have otherwise. That's all the justification I need. Some say you're a hero. Others call you a criminal. What do you call yourself?" "I call myself Ruth Carter's daughter," Naomi said simply. "Everything I did because of what she taught me. She showed me how to measure carefully, how to plan thoroughly, how to build things that last. I just applied those lessons to fighting instead of carpentry." The interview appeared in newspapers across the North, accompanied by excerpts from Griggs's confession and testimonies from the Thornhill workers. Public opinion divided sharply. Some praised the uprising as justified resistance, others condemned it as lawless violence. But no one could deny the fundamental truth: cruelty had met consequence. Over the following years, Naomi became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, using her mother's networks to guide hundreds to freedom. She never returned to Thornhill. There was nothing left to return to. The plantation had been dismantled completely, the land lying fallow, avoided by locals who claimed it was haunted. Let them believe in ghosts, Naomi thought. The real ghosts were the living ones, the masters and overseers who slept soundly because they'd convinced themselves their victims weren't fully human. Those ghosts needed haunting. On the 10th anniversary of her mother's death, Naomi traveled back to the coastal Maroon settlement where the army had first assembled. Marcus was still there, older but still organizing. Hannah had moved to Canada, but sent regular letters. Many of the 400 who had marched on Thornhill were dead casualties of the ongoing struggle, but some had lived, had built families, had passed down the story. Naomi stood where the gathering fire had burned. That night when she was 11, when she had asked 60 strangers to risk everything for an impossible cause. She thought about the maps her mother had drawn, the networks carefully constructed over years. She thought about 400 people answering her call. She thought about Thomas Griggs swinging from that oak tree, his confession sealed and distributed. Justice, she had learned, was not a destination but a direction. Every person freed, every overseer held accountable, every small victory against slavery's machinery, these were not endings but steps along an endless path. Her mother had walked that path quietly, Naomi had walked it loudly. Both approaches had value, both had costs, but the path itself remained, and others would walk it after she was gone. A young woman approached as the sun set, perhaps 16, with defiant eyes and work-scarred hands. "You're Naomi Carter, aren't you? The one who brought the army?" I'm planning something. My plantation, up the river. The overseer there makes Griggs look merciful. I heard what you did, and I thought, maybe it's possible." Naomi studied the girl's face, seeing her own 11-year-old self reflected there. The same desperate hope, the same willingness to risk everything, the same refusal to die quietly. "It's possible," Naomi said, "but it's also dangerous. People will die." "People are dying anyway," the girl replied. "At least this way, it means something." Naomi thought about that for a long moment. Then she pulled out a map, an updated version of the ones her mother had drawn, showing routes and safe houses and friendly contacts. She had carried it for years, adding to it, refining it, preparing for exactly this moment. "Come," she said, "let me show you how to plan a revolution." They walked together to the settlement buildings, teacher and student, carrying forward work that would outlive them both. Behind them, the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire, and in the gathering darkness. The work continued as it had before, as it would after, as it must until the day when justice was no longer something claimed by force but given freely to all. From the archives of the American Anti-Slavery Society, compiled between 1831 and 1834, drawn from newspaper records, militia reports, and oral histories preserved by the descendants of those who witnessed these events. Naomi Carter's final years are not well documented. Some records suggest she continued resistance work until the Civil War. Others claim she settled in Canada and lived quietly, training new conductors in secret. What is known with certainty is this: an 11-year-old girl watched her mother die, ran into the night, assembled 400 fighters, and showed the world that even the powerless can claim justice when they find the courage to demand it. May this account serve as testament to Ruth Carter, who built the path, and Naomi Carter, who showed others how to walk it. May their names be remembered when the names of their oppressors are forgotten. May their work echo through generations, inspiring resistance wherever cruelty takes root. For in the end, this is the truth that Thornhill Plantation learned, and that every system of oppression must eventually face. You can take everything from people: their labor, their dignity, their lives, but you cannot take their capacity for justice. And when that capacity manifests, when the oppressed finally say enough, the foundations of empire crack and crumble like clay in fire. This is the story of Naomi Carter, who measured revenge the way her mother measured wood, carefully, precisely, and with an eye toward building something that would last. And it did last. It lasts still, in every act of resistance, every claim for dignity. Every refusal to accept cruelty is inevitable. The path continues forward, always forward, until we all are free.